Welcome to the Safety Break, the Whitewater Rescue Podcast. We're here to share stories of real river accidents and rescues and find expert advice on how to solve the problems you might encounter in the Whitewater River environment. I'm your host, Jack Diddy, an emergency medicine physician, whitewater paddler, and wilderness medicine educator. Together, I hope we can celebrate successful rescues and learn from our mistakes in a supportive environment. If you have a story to share of a non-fatal accident or rescue, send me an email at thesafetybreak@gmail.com or contact me on our Facebook page, The Safety Break. If you like what you hear, hit the subscribe button and follow us on social media. I hope you learned something valuable in the show. There's a few rites of passage as a whitewater paddler. The first combat roll, first gnarly swim, first waterfall, and unfortunately for many of us, the first shoulder dislocation. These injuries are incredibly painful and quite debilitating until you get it reduced back to its appropriate position. Paddling is not really an option when your arm is out of socket, and even walking a rough trail or bushwhacking out of a deep river canyon can be extremely difficult. For those of us that spend time in wilderness areas that are far removed from outside assistance, this is one of those injuries that you might want to learn how to fix on site. In part one of this topic, we hear a story from a paddler who dislocated his shoulder in one of the worst possible places, deep in the remote vertical walled canyon of the Stikine River in northwestern British Columbia. We'll also hear from Barrett Wood, a wilderness EMT and instructor at Solo, an organization affiliated with the Nantahala Outdoor Center that teaches wilderness first responder and wilderness first aid courses. We'll be emphasizing the concepts involved with field treatment of shoulder dislocations. Basically how to recognize it and treat it on scene. Now, a little disclaimer. It takes more than a quick podcast listen to learn this, but it's a pretty simple skill, and with just a little bit of hands-on instruction, you can learn how to do it. Hopefully this discussion will inspire you to get the training you need. And since shoulder health is so important for kayakers, there's a lot more to talk about. Part 2 of this topic is an interview with Liz Cook, a physical therapist who specializes in sports medicine rehabilitation and coaching of outdoor athletes. In that discussion, we talk about how to pick up the pieces and start the healing process after you've had the dislocation, and some preventative ideas as well. Sorry for my rough voice on this episode. I had a recent rib fracture from a freak gardening accident, and now a new kitten in our house that I'm allergic to and I think is plotting to kill me and jumps on my face in the middle of the night. Hopefully it's not too distracting for you. So, let's get on with our first guest. Bernie Engelman is a phenomenally talented paddler. He's a threat for the podium in any Class 5 creek race, a great downriver freestyle paddler, and has some serious expedition paddling under his belt. On our Facebook site, I posted a link to his video from his recent trip exploring some big water Class 5 in Madagascar. I had the fun experience of paddling a fully flushed high water run in the Smokies with him last year, and while I was just hanging on doing the survival boating thing, he was throwing kick flips off the tops of all the waves. So the Stikine River was right up his alley, but some mild nagging left shoulder pain had been brewing for some months. The river was still running at early season levels, which means pretty powerful water. Let's hear the story from him.
I'm Bernie Engelman. I'm a longtime whitewater kayaker and I'm originally from the East Coast, and now I'm living out in Washington State. But this summer, about mid-July, me and a team were up in northern Canada paddling the Stikine River. Got up there. None of us had done it before. We had heard from our mentors that we had to show ourselves down. We weren't allowed to be. So we did a 3-day. We did for our first lap. It was really slow. We took our time. We scouted virtually every big rapid and and really had a lot of time at camp every day, which was really nice. It was a beautiful canyon to kind of soak in. But then after that, we went back for a 2-day, which felt great kind of after getting accustomed to the canyon. And then we reset shuttle and put right back on for a 2-day. And we were about a third of the way down the section. And there's this rapid called Wall 1. I guess the name says it, but it's pretty obvious. Like you get to it and then like all the like sides of the river kind of just go vertical. You can't scout it and you can't portage. And it's kind of a heinous it's a heinous little spot in the river, and it changed in a recent year from a landslide. But you just have to like, basically just go through this probably like 6-7 foot tall wave hole on river left and avoid a really bad pour over hole on river right. The first 2 laps had varying degrees of success, but overall I like made it through okay. And on our 3rd lap, I was paddling in and I hit that first big feature, kind of like leading with my left blade, tucking up a little bit. And then kind of like just when I hit the pile, I was going so fast and I just felt my shoulder pop right out. And I immediately felt it. And I was like, oh no, that sucks. And I like couldn't paddle on my left side. All I could do is on my right. So I was taking right strokes and I effectively just spun sideways and then dropped right into the next kind of pour over ledge hole that's like a little bit offset center right. I just like flipped over immediately, just like waited until I flushed. As soon as I went into that hole, I was like, oh shit, I better not swim. But then I got flush. I rolled up with lots of pain and then kind of just ruddered my way. Eventually my friend Lewis Norris and Taylor Cofer were with me like immediately in that moment. And Lewis clipped into my boat with his his tow tether, and actually it was like all class 1 too, so he towed me to shore through the eddy line, which was really nice because the boils and the eddy lines there are quite it takes some force to get across them, and I didn't think I was actually capable of getting across the eddy line, so it was nice. The canyon opened up just a little bit right before Garden of the Gods, and there's this big landslide that comes in on River Right, and that's where I was able to get out.
I think we should pause for a moment to consider the severity of Bernie's situation here, and to think about some of the decisions he and his crew have to make. He's in a vertical walled canyon with only a few exit points, with Big Water Class 5 rapids downstream, and a hike out through dense, grizzly country that could take days. This is the type of place that you want to know how to deal with an injury like this. First of all, you need to know how to accurately identify the injury. If you confirm that it's a simple shoulder dislocation, you then need to decide if it's appropriate to try to fix it on scene or wait until you get to definitive medical care. How do you then try to reduce it? What do you do if you can't? These are all the immediate questions that Bernie and crew had to answer. Let's hear their approach, and then we'll dive into more of the details.
My team got to me really quickly, and they immediately began making a plan or like talking about how we were going to try to get the shoulder back in because I was in a lot of pain. We had a team of like 6 or 7. They were all like really, really experienced paddlers and had a lot of input as to like what they've seen things work and everything. So I think I was just chock full of adrenaline. I was like, okay, like we should try to get this back in. And so we tried a couple different techniques. The first thing we did was try to do me laying on a rock and then like extending my arm roughly at 90 degrees down and slowly applying weight. They were kind of like tying it to my forearm, slowly tying my helmet to my forearm and like putting little rocks in it. So they were like trying to slowly add weight until the shoulder popped back into socket. But that was like 10 out of 10 pain, super, super excruciating. And I tried it for a little bit, but I eventually just couldn't. It just felt so bad. And then eventually I was like, man, I don't know how much more of that I can take. So we tried another tactic where it was like I was kind of sitting up straight and somebody was like gently applying pressure at my elbow joint, kind of downward. And they like maintained pressure for a while some people massaged around my like trap and just trying to get my muscles to relax. And then we tried kind of like standing facing one another, pulling it back down, but it was incredibly painful trying it from my end of things. So so we really tried to put it back in for about like 30 to 40 minutes before it was like, man, we should probably stop. But I mean, my muscles, like my around, like my pec and like my shoulders and everything were just like, they started shaking and spasming really hard. And like, we're just kind of like so locked up that I think that it was like pretty unrealistic to try to do it without damaging something, without like some sort of I don't know. It felt really bad.
As you can see, these guys gave it their best shot, but unfortunately some of these injuries can just be really stubborn to fix. Kudos to them for knowing what to do and giving it a solid effort. Muscle relaxation is the key piece to most successful reductions, but it can be difficult to achieve, especially in a really fit athlete. In the ER, we have the advantage of using sedative medications to achieve the muscle relaxation and pain control needed to manipulate these things back into position. But even with that, some of these can just be really difficult. We're going to come back to Bernie later to hear about his journey back to civilization, which sounds like an ordeal even with the assistance of a helicopter evacuation. But first, I want to get into the details of shoulder dislocation treatment. Let's talk with Barrett Wood, an instructor with Solo, a group affiliated with the NOC that teaches wilderness medicine.
Yeah, my name's Barrett Wood. I am a wilderness EMT, and I work full-time for Solo Southeast. We're a division of the Nantahala Outdoor Center, and we teach wilderness medicine and wilderness survival.
So for those that may be unfamiliar, what exactly is this injury that we're talking about?
So the dislocation, it can sometimes present with other injuries alongside it, but really at its core, we're talking about displacement of the humerus from the glenoid, which is the cup on the end of your scapula, and the ball, the head of your humerus, kind of rotates in there. And so when we have that shoulder dislocation, we have some sort of impact down the chain of the arm that forces the head of the humerus out of this socket.
So before we talk about treatment, we need to make sure we're dealing with the right thing. In my experience, most people with this injury are able to tell exactly what's going on. It's a very distinct and disturbing sensation. How do you recognize the injury in the field without the benefit of an x-ray?
So the shoulder dislocation is one of those injuries that generally we can do a pretty darn good job of diagnosing in the field because we get a couple significant physical findings. The overwhelming majority of them are what we call anterior, so it's moving forward, it's moving down away from the socket. But what will happen there is that as that gets pulled out, the muscle moves with it, and you end up with this little cup, this little kind of concavity in the shoulder. You generally, when everything's in position, you get a nice curvature of the shoulder if you're looking at somebody straight on. But if that shoulder has been dislocated, what we get instead is this shoulder comes to a point. And right below that point is this little cup. And if you walk your fingers over their shoulder, and you can do this on yourself, just sitting there, you can check and feel that things slope nicely and you've got that good pad of muscle coming over the outside. But when the shoulder's dislocated, we don't get that. We get this sharp point because the bone is out of that humeral head is out of the way, and now we're running kind of right over the edge of the scapula. So another thing that we can do is, because it's going to get pushed out of the way, I like to kind of look and see, are my patient's elbows at the same point on their body? Is one lower than the other and just sitting up kind of square their way? So we look at that. It's a super painful injury most of the time. But there are other things that can be painful too. But generally we see a significant kind of beyond the just a stinger, just a bruise pain level with this. The other thing that we go to then is range of motion. It's super painful. We really get a lot of weakness. The hand usually still works, but our ability to pivot that arm is really, really reduced. And so those are kind of my go-tos. I look, can I see the deformity? And is that deformity presenting where I expect it for a shoulder dislocation, or is it presenting somewhere else? Have we broken a collarbone? Have we broken the humerus itself? And then I get into what's the mobility in the rest of the arm look like to help me make that determination of dislocated or not dislocated.
One other exam clue is that patients with dislocations generally can't rest their elbow all the way down against their body. They often have to prop it up in this slightly extended position and leaning their torso forward to help hold it there. Any attempt to bring it closer increases the pain. It's also helpful to expose both shoulders so you have a normal-looking shoulder to compare it to. This will usually make the deformity more obvious.
Yeah, it's really helpful. Dry suits make this really hard. And getting somebody out of a dry suit with a shoulder injury, whether it's a dislocation or not, is going to be a project, but it's really worth it because that left-right comparison is so huge.
One of the other common injuries that you may hear about is shoulder separations or acromioclavicular separations. What is that injury exactly?
The AC joint, it's the intersection between the shoulder blade and the collarbone. And when you separate that, usually that happens from a direct impact rather than kind of a wrench. But the AC will separate, and if it's a significant separation, those ligaments tear, and the collarbone starts to lift up. And so instead of the shoulder coming to a point, we get this kind of bump partway down the kind of the top surface of the shoulder. And that's one of the usual diagnosticals that I look at for AC versus shoulder, just from visual scan.
So it's really important to distinguish this from fractures, AC separations, and rotator cuff injuries. Knowing the mechanism of injury is one of the most important pieces to help make this distinction. With leverage of an extended arm, think dislocation or rotator cuff injury. With direct impact to the joint, think fracture or AC separation. Basically, fractures and separations occur during droughts when kayakers try to ride mountain bikes and get that direct impact injury to the shoulder. But when the mechanism is more of a leverage force applied to an extended arm, particularly on a high brace, that's when you think about dislocations.
For the way we teach it, if we've got direct force to the shoulder, the Solo's recommendations don't attempt to reduce because of there's such a big risk that we're misdiagnosing an AC or that there is that co-presenting fracture.
The pain is so severe with this that the patient will probably want it fixed right away, and most people can't really function well while it's out. To me, that's one of the most important reasons to fix this on scene, especially if you're in a remote or rugged environment without an easy exit. You have to think about how the injury affects the safety of the individual and of the entire group. If you get the arm back into position, the person becomes much more capable of taking care of themselves. They're still going to have some pain, and their shoulder is going to be in a pretty weak condition. So paddling hard white water right away is really not a safe option. But they should be much more capable to walk out of the river if the dislocation is corrected. What are some of the other reasons that you might want to try to reduce a dislocation on site rather than waiting until you get to a medical facility?
I think you've hit one of the biggest ones, which is pain management. And this is not something that's really going to be fixable with Tylenol or fixable with ibuprofen as far as real pain management. So that's a significant piece. The other components that I look at is as we displace those bones, we start to put pressure on places that the body really isn't built for it. And we worry about this pinching nerves and pinching blood vessels. So those are kind of my biggest things. You're unlikely to get life-threatening problems result from a dislocated shoulder that I'm aware of, but we can have a huge amount of pain and we can do damage to the tissue. We can have long-term impacts to the functionality of that arm if we leave it out of place, putting pressure on a nerve, putting pressure on a blood vessel. So those are my big things outside of the direct patient comfort piece.
So obviously in a podcast format, we really can't teach the exact reduction techniques. You really need a hands-on course to do that. Which of the courses at Solo address this?
This is within the scope of practice for the higher levels of wilderness care, the wilderness EMT, the wilderness first responder. But this is not risk-free. And so at that wilderness first aid level, we don't teach reduction of dislocations because the risk is if they've hit their shoulder and they've got a break, if we start manipulating that, we can go from a hairline fracture to a complete fracture, and we can make an injury worse. So that's why we restrict this to this is only in wilderness setting.
We've been using the term reduction, which is basically the process of manipulating the arm back into its appropriate position. We're going to try to describe a few of these techniques. With all these, there's a few key principles. First, you only do it if the patient wants it to happen, and you're certain that it's just a simple, isolated shoulder dislocation. You never really do this on a person with multiple traumatic injuries. Second, all of these techniques involve very gentle and slow pressure. There's no abrupt or harsh movements. You want to channel your inner Barry White here. Third, the key piece of reduction is getting the muscles to relax. It's hard to do, but you have to convince the patient into relaxing as much of the voluntary control of the shoulder muscles as possible. So what are some of the techniques that you like to use and to teach?
There's several techniques, and all with ups and downs. The one that I have stuck to most recently and been very successful with is what's called the Cunningham technique. And so what we do is we just try to get the patient sitting up in a comfortable position with some gentle downward traction, downward pressure in their elbow, and then we just massage the joint. But if I can get the pec, the bicep, the tricep, the deltoid, and the trapezius to just relax, we let those other stabilizers inside the muscle, this deeper tissues, to just do their thing and just pull that cup back in. It's a very shallow ball and socket joint. That's why all the mobility is there. And your shoulder is really mostly stabilized by those muscles. And so if we get them all to just relax and get that muscle spasm to stop, the shoulder will, to a certain extent, self-correct. And so that's the technique that is my first up, and that I've been using for I think the last 2 or 3 shoulders that I've reduced and been very successful. And the thing that I like about it is I'm not moving things around. I'm just getting the muscles to relax, letting the body do it. If I need to, sometimes I'll add a little bit of external rotation where I start to kind of leave the elbow where it is, but start to bring the hand out away from the body to help align the humeral head with the cup, the glenoid on the scapula a little bit better. And so that's worked really well for me. You can also do the traditional kind of opposing force traction where you brace in the armpit and we simply pull away from the body at the wrist, at the elbow. It's straightforward, which is nice, but it does involve a lot of movement of the arm, and that can be really painful for patients. When I think about teaching this, one of the things I think about is like for other stuff that's displaced, other dislocations, or angulated fractures, we're usually kind of pulling. Ultimately, we're kind of pulling the direction we want to go. This is the only counterintuitive thing with some of these is that we're pulling down on the arm, and we ultimately want it to go back up. And when I think about explaining that to people, what I think about is we're trying to create space that we've got tension kind of from like the whole of the rotator cuff, all the muscles, all the tendons, everything's kind of trying to pull the humeral head back into position, but it's kind of stuck on the lip of the scapula, and that downward pull just gives enough space for the body to realign, and then it'll just suck itself back in. And I feel like for me, it's always been a super satisfying thing. My patient feels so much better right away, and it's one of those few things where we get kind of instant results from our efforts.
And again, with all of these, muscle relaxation is the real key. I try to focus on verbally coaching the patient through the relaxation part. There's a few other techniques worth mentioning as well. In Bernie's story, he described the Stimson technique, which involves lying prone with the arm hanging down and gradual weight applied to the arm. You can also do a quick internet search to see various methods of applying traction to the arm, but they all boil down to the same thing, which is disengaging the humerus from the lip of the glenoid so that it can then slip back into the socket. A little bit of external rotation of the arm generally helps as well. The scapula can be manipulated into a better position to allow the reduction to occur. That can be achieved by rotating the inferior and lateral portion of the scapula towards the midline of the spine. It's usually very obvious when you successfully achieve the reduction. The arm visibly moves back into position, and you can feel and hear a clunk-type sound as the bones shift. The patient will generally have immediate and significant improvement in the amount of pain. How else can you tell that it's back into the right position?
The pain relief is a big one. I just looked at my shoulder playing rugby, and that was a massively painful thing. And as soon as it went back in, my pain went from really all-consuming and kind of from a 8 or 9 out of 10 to like a 3 or 4 out of 10. And for the patients that I've treated, and my result has been that deformity goes away.
And what do you do immediately afterward?
I want to do a gentle check of range of motion. I don't want to go all the way to the limits, because as we move further and further to the limits of that range of motion, we take away those muscles' ability to stabilize and engage and hold things in place. So I want to check gently their range of motion. Can they reach up and touch their opposite collarbone? It's probably going to be my last thing that I do, because then I want to package and bandage. Unless there's a critical need for them to be able to use this arm, I really don't want them using it. And so I like to kind of end my range of motion check in the position where I'm then going to sling and swath and bandage for evacuation.
There's several ways to improvise slings with spray skirts or clothing. I like to just carry a small cloth sling with me in my river kit. It weighs almost nothing and takes up little space, and they have them at most pharmacies. As we heard in Bernie's story, though, sometimes the reduction attempts don't work. How do you know when to stop trying?
If my patient is on board with this, let's give it 2 honest tries. And in some cases, to get those muscles to relax, it may be 10 minutes of just gentle, keep them calm, gently kind of 1 ounce at a time, increase the pressure. But there's going to be some pain involved as we manipulate this and try to get this back into place. But there has to be a limit at which we say, I'm simply hurting a person. I'm not helping anymore. It's time for me to stop. And the rule of thumb is 2 good, honest attempts. And if you don't get it on the second one, you're not likely to get it on the third. And so you're better off simply saying, let's not manipulate this further. Let's not cause more pain. There may be something else at play. There may be damage to the cartilage. There may be something blocking this from ever going back in without surgery. And at that point, because we don't have the imaging, we don't have the tools, it's time to stop.
This decision is really going to be situationally dependent and ultimately up to the patient to make the call. You're then going to need to just sling or package up the arm in the position that it's most comfortable and try to get to medical care as soon as possible. How can people get a hold of your organization for more education about this?
Yeah, they can find us online. We're part of the NOC, and so noc.com. If you go to the instruction page, you'll find the links for Solo, for our survival and our medicine programs. We also have southeastwildernessmedicine.com. And then people are always welcome to come knock on our door. We're on the NOC campus at the Nanahalo Commercial Takeout, and you can see where our office is on the campus map. So come on and knock on the door, come say hi. We're always happy to see folks and answer questions.
Let's get back to Bernie to hear more about how this was finally solved for him.
We ended up calling a chopper about an hour after the dislocation happened. I think it was pretty clear that I was not going to be paddling out of the rest of the canyon. A lot of the biggest rapids on the entire section are still downstream in even more committing gorges than we were currently in. So it seemed like a bad idea to continue, obviously, even if my shoulder got back in. But then the hike out was also about like 50K from a road through very, very dense wilderness, lots of large mammal predators. And that was not very inspiring either. So helicopter seemed like the best bet. At wall 1, down for the next like 200 yards, it's like just vertical rock wall into the river on either side. But then as soon as it kind of approaches the Garden of the Gods rapid, like a rock type shifts or something like that, and the granite goes away, and like this huge landslide comes in on River Right. And it was the landslide that kind of made the heli rescue possible for us, to be honest, because most of the canyon is heavily vegetated in like boreal forest or just vertical rock. I was actually really fortunate. We had a team of Kiwis with us, though, and those guys, it was Harry Hasselman and Sandy McEwen, who were in BC at the time. They kind of met us up there, but they had a ton of experience with helicopters because of flying around in New Zealand. And Sandy's been on like a tons of expeditions around BC, so he at least knew like which services to contact. And Sandy was the one who put out the distress call in the first place. He was the one who like contacted people and like got it all squared away. So, yeah, I was really grateful to have some helicopter savvy people on the river with us just so they could like kind of identify what like we could and could not do moving forward. So we were by land about a 6 or 7 hour drive from anywhere that had a proper hospital. So what ended up happening was a team in Stewart responded. So I dislocated my shoulder at 3:30. The call went out around 4:30. They got the call around like 6. And then they eventually flew into the canyon, but there wasn't really anything flat near us. He ended up having to just kind of like put one skid down on this semi-flat spot that was probably 4 foot by 4 foot wide. It just had total clearance behind it, so he was able to like get his tail clear of any vegetation. Eventually the chopper came back through. It had to go off and get fuel because it spent a lot of fuel kind of buzzing around the canyon looking for us. And so we had to fly like an hour out to refuel and come back, which was like a 2-hour ordeal. And then once it plucked me out of the canyon, I was climbing into the helicopter at about 9:15, 9:20 p.m. And there it doesn't get dark until like midnight. But and then the heli ride out was spectacular at sunset, like flying right back over the Wall One Canyon. Like we buzzed right over the rapid that I like dislocated my shoulder at. And then we, on the way out, we saw like grizzly bears and full grown bull moose and like all kinds of wildlife up in the tundra just on the rim, which was pretty cool. But we got a little lost. His navigation system or something wasn't like functioning correctly or something. I think some like battery died. Anyway, we burned up a little bit more fuel than expected, and we had to touch down at this airstrip that was at this like random mine in between the Stikine and Stewart. And we got grounded because it was getting dark. So we made it about halfway in the helicopter to the hospital. And at this point, my shoulder's still very much out of socket. And yeah, so I was just kind of, trying to keep it together while they were trying to figure out a plan once we landed to get me back to Stewart, which was 3.5 hours by car away. And there was actually these locals there who worked in the mine or like in the logging operation there. And they were kind enough to just totally volunteer their vehicle. They just rode along with us, but then the search and rescue team basically commandeered their vehicle and drove me approximately halfway to Stewart, where another team they were like going to intercept us midway. Like they left Stewart as soon as we left the airstrip. So I was passed off, but this all happened like late into the night. Like we were leaving the airstrip around midnight, and all these like random people, and a lot of them weren't even involved with search and rescue, but they all kind of like stepped up and volunteered their time and resources to help me get to the hospital in the middle of the night, which was super, super gracious and generous of them. But the ride there was really, really painful with all the bumps in the road. But I eventually made it to the hospital about 2:30 in the morning. It was kind of funny. Like it was tiny. I mean, Stewart, British Columbia, really, really tiny, like little fishing town in the Prince William Sound. And there's like a door, like a bell on the hospital that we had to ring to wake up a night nurse who like would let us in, onboarded us, and then called the doctor in, and he came in and helped out, which was really, really, really nice. Yeah, I was the only patient. They don't have any overnight beds there. So they just sit in. This was like 2 or 3 in the morning at this point that I actually got to see the doctor, and they just gave me sedation immediately. Like the doctor was like, holy shit, this has been out for like 11 hours. Like, let's knock you out immediately. And that's like was kind of his approach. But he knocked me out right away and then set it back in. And then I just woke up from a very deep, restful sleep with my shoulder back in place, which was really nice. And then they woke up, took me to a hotel, and yeah. And then when I was walking around this tiny like BC town the next morning, just kind of like collecting myself, all these like random people knew my name, and it was like a pretty funny experience. But my friends came and got me the next day, and then we drove home, and I had to piece it all back together. But yeah, my boat's still in there.
Bernie has a long road of healing ahead. Last we spoke, he had an MRI and was trying to sort out various options to either rehab or surgically repair the injury. In part 2 of this topic, we'll talk with Liz Cook, a physical therapist who can provide some good insight into the healing process. Look for that episode soon. Many thanks to my guests today, Barrett Wood and Bernie Engelman. This episode is being published just a few days before Golly Fest 2023. The Safety Break is going to have a booth there, helping AW with safety outreach and collecting interviews from anyone that wants to tell their story of an interesting river rescue or injury. If you want some free education about this shoulder reduction skill, CPR, or any other wilderness medical topics you want to chat about, look for our booth. I hope to see you at the party and on the river. Bernie wanted to give a last word of gratitude to the people who helped him out of the canyon that day. Let's wish him well on his recovery process.
Thank you to the crew that was with me for their patience, and also thanks to the search and rescue crew who kind of, I definitely, any heli rescue is done with kind of an understood level of risk, and I was really, really appreciative that the pilot and the team was willing to kind of like get in there in a less than ideal circumstance to help me out and get me to help. So I'm definitely grateful for that. But the Stewart Search and Rescue, can't thank you all enough. I don't think I could have effectively fought off the predators with just one arm. I don't know how well that would have worked, but yeah, I was super grateful that they were able to pluck me out of there.
Thank you for listening to The Safety Break, the Whitewater Rescue Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button and click follow on our Facebook page so we know that you're out there. I'm also looking for more stories. If you know of an interesting non-fatal river accident or rescue, send me a few details by email, safetybreak@gmail.com. It doesn't have to be dramatic or life-threatening, just something that we all might be able to learn from. I'll see if we can turn it into an episode. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the river.